I like to tell folks that USCIS is the warm fuzzy organization within the Department of Homeland Security. If you're a foreign national who wants to come here, why is it moving automatically? If you're a foreign national who wants to come here to visit, to study, to work, or to become a citizen, that's what we do. So we have roughly 19,000 employees, about 1,000 people in the Office of Information Technology. We manage approximately 100 active development projects at any given time. And we began our Agile journey in 2011. This is what it looks like. Back in 2011, like many of you, we were a waterfall shop. It took roughly 180 days for us to deliver a new system or to make major changes to an existing one. And then this fella came on board named Mark Schwartz, and he said, we're going to be Agile. So we did have an interim step there. We had a time-boxed waterfall solution that forced teams to deliver every 30 to 45 days. And that turned out to be a good transition because it helped teams deliver smaller increments more frequently. But almost at the same time, we began training everybody in Agile Scrum and quickly moved to that. With Agile Scrum, we were able to deliver projects in about 2 to 4 weeks, roughly. And then that was great, but it wasn't good enough. So we decided we wanted to go to more of a continuous flow. And in order to do that, we adopted Kanban. Today we have teams doing Agile Scrum, doing Kanban, doing Scrumban, and some doing now DevOps. So with Kanban, we moved to 5 to 14 days, and with DevOps, or probably for us, we would call it DevSecOps because security is so big in what we do. We are delivering every 1 to 2 days or less. There's another facet to this, this whole evolution that's kind of hard to illustrate. But back in the waterfall days, we had development teams that developed, and then they threw code over a very high wall into production where the operations teams had to install and maintain it. And the developers really didn't have much to do with it after that until it was time to make new code. Today, we have developers working hand in hand with security teams, working hand in hand with operations teams from cradle to grave. And the other thing that's changed is our infrastructure teams are really in charge of the underlying infrastructure. Our development teams are in charge of their production code. So not only are they in charge of the development effort, but they're in charge of the way their code performs in development, in production, excuse me. So where we are now. This list could easily be 3 or 4 times as long as this, but these are some of the key areas we're focusing on right now. We continue to focus very heavily in automated testing. We use tools like JUnit, Jacoco, Jasmine, many, many others. We are into cloud provisioning, mostly to Amazon Web Services. We're into containerization, typically with Docker. Today, I think a big focus is microservices. So we've gotten into microservice architecture. We looked across our applications and we realized that so many of them had some basic shared functions. That they were either identical or very, very similar. So rather than continuing to have teams duplicate their development efforts, we're pulling that stuff out and putting it into a microservice that can be consumed by any application that needs it now or in the future. Underlying all of this has been some innovative governance practices, and there are many, but the 2 key branches, there's 2 of them. The first one, and probably the most obvious one, is a shift from the old style documentation to what we're calling signals. In the old days, development teams not only had to produce code, but they had to produce some pretty elaborate documents. And that was the way we provided oversight and governance and proved that they were doing what they were supposed to. Instead of doing that in Agile, you really can't do that in Agile. Instead of that, we look at the signals coming out of their processes, their pipelines, and their production systems. And by that, we are able to provide the right oversight to know where the systems are, how they're performing, and how the teams are really doing. The other thing that we've done is become more of an enabler. It used to be that QA sort of waited until they were done, and then we assessed what they did. What we do now is we try to get in at the beginning and figure out how to help teams. So early on, the big focus of that effort was the Agile training programs that Melinda helped develop. And that still continues to be a big effort today. But some other examples, another big one was that we helped teams bring in scanning engines to automate some of the things that we would have done in oversight. So We have scanning tools that look at code quality, at security issues, and now at accessibility, or what we call Section 508. In addition to that, in doing the code scanning, we vetted these engines and then turned them over to the teams. We also helped them hone down the rule sets to eliminate false positives and get to the rules that really mattered. So if you look at SonarQube, I don't know what it ships with today, but back when we first implemented it, I think it shipped with something like 650 rules. We kind of boiled that down to something like 40. The 40 rules that didn't throw up a lot of false positives and we felt really mattered. And we'll continue to refine that with the teams as we go along. The group that's responsible for all of that innovative governance was the Delivery Assurance Branch. This is the branch that's responsible for ensuring that USCIS deploys high-quality information and communications technology that meets federal statutes. In addition to that, this group is a key interface between USCIS and auditors. Like many other people in regulated industries, we have visits announced and unannounced by auditors all the time. The problem for us is that most of those guys are accustomed to working in the old world. Okay, we're back to automatically moving on me. So they'll arrive on site and say, show me your documentation. And we're like, yeah, we don't have much of that. So we have to work with the development teams and these auditors to take them through and show them the signals we're getting from processes, pipelines, and production systems. Now, why do we do this? Well, it's the law. When they come, we have to answer. But in addition, we honor the social contract this way. Not only as federal employees, we're responsible for ensuring that we use taxpayer money wisely. But in addition, and particularly for USCIS, we are very, very aware of the fact that we are helping the federal government confer what could be the most precious benefit that an individual could receive, which is their citizenship. That means a great deal to us. So I told you that we have 100 development projects in process at any given time. And boy, I wish we had the time because I'd love to tell you about a good half dozen of them. They're all unique. Well, many of them are unique. We have a couple of different technology stacks going, and we have teams using different processes and different pipelines, whatever works for them the best to deliver the code. But our biggest one, and that's the one that we'll focus on today, is the electronic immigration system, otherwise known as ELIS. So what does that one look like? Here are some key facts, but I'll summarize it by saying that ELIS is a very large development project that supports a system of systems. That's right, ELIS is not one system, it's many. And to give you an idea how big it is, okay, let me find those statistics. We have a report that comes out every day that is about 26 pages long that the business looks at, and it has all the key business indicators. And I took a look at that, the one I got last Sunday, and what it says is that in FY18, ELIS processed 435,000 green cards, 545,000 applications for employment authorization, 579,000 green card renewals, 702,000, actually almost 703,000 applications for naturalization, for a total, in addition to other forms, of 2.8 million forms. Now, that may not sound like a whole lot to the IRS, but I think we're doing something that's maybe a little bit more critical than at least my taxes when we're doing citizenship. So we're pretty proud of it. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Melinda, who will take you through some of the measures we use to make that program a success.
All right. So it's a non-trivial task to take this very large system of systems, in addition to the other 100 systems that we have going on, and find a way to measure quality. Because we're responsible for responding to audits and having an audit-ready posture all the time. So what we discovered was that actually the easiest way to do this is to use and leverage all of the systems that we already have to do the job of making the software to begin with. And so we started looking at some of the data repositories that we had where we had perhaps some indicators of health. So our developers use Confluence to use it as a wiki to identify any information that they think may be relevant in the future about decision making, including design information. We have JIRA, which we use to house our user stories and our defects and any incidents. We use Jenkins as our orchestration tool, and so that's going to give us information about our builds, when they're happening, how successful they are. New Relic is our tool that we use to monitor operations. And then we also get information for operations from Splunk. And then we use Amazon Web Services to look at information about containerization and auto-scaling, depending on how many people are hitting the server at any given time. So we have all this data, and it would be really helpful if there was this universal definition of quality. But that's not something that actually exists within our organization, and that's because lots of different parts of the agency are looking at different metrics to figure out what is quality for them. And so there isn't a panacea. So if you were hoping to come here and find out what is that silver bullet metric that we use for quality, you're not going to find it. Instead, we're going to give you some information about a whole bunch of other signals that we use to try to identify opportunities for improvement before the auditors find it. So we could respond to this circumstance by trying to identify as many pieces of data as possible and having some exhaustive, complex approach to risk management. But what that's going to do is it's going to create a lot more overhead, and it's going to create a lot of headaches for the people who are just trying to create quality software and get it into production so that we can get feedback from our end users. So that's not what we did. Instead, we decided, let's use the data we already have and let's just count things. And then we'll figure out which counts are giving us real information and which counts are just noise. When we first moved to Agile from waterfall, we took the approach of mandating in a management instruction that every team would have to participate in 8 specific types of activities. And we started to measure how many of those teams are being successful at doing those activities. So this is just an activity report. It's showing whether or not teams are participating in retrospectives. Are they participating in release planning activities? Are they engaging with their product owner? So this information doesn't necessarily tell us that these activities are providing quality. It's just telling us whether the activities are occurring. And when we first moved to Agile, there were a lot of resistors to the change. And so it would give us an indication whether or not the culture was actually shifting to a model that would allow us to deliver faster so that we could get more feedback, so that we could figure out whether or not we had a quality product. So this was our starting place. There's no shame in counting activity. Activity can give you a lot of information, but it's not going to give you quality information. It's going to give you culture information. And culture information influences quality. We also were counting the same things that were always counted before: failed deployments, poor test coverage, escaped defects, and test result problems, right? But the challenge with those types of measurements is those things occur after the fact. Once you have an escaped defect or a failed deployment, you already have a quality problem. We want to understand where our organization has systemic problems that are just starting to emerge so that we can get ahead of them before they actually become problems to our end users. So our goal is to catch dysfunction early. And sometimes finding dysfunction early comes from unusual sources. So these signals that we look at are faint signals. Each signal does not tell us all of the information we need, so we need to bundle a bunch of these faint signals together so that we can get a bigger picture about what's going on. So now we're going to look at some of these signals that may show us some dysfunction early. Our first topic is deployments. So one of the things we started counting is, can we deploy every day? Just really simple. How many days do we have deployments, and how many days don't we? Deployment success comes from practice. The more you deploy, the better you get at it. It's like putting on socks. When my son was 4 years old, he wanted to put on his own socks, but he didn't have a lot of experience doing it. It would take him a long time, and we would end up with a sock situation that maybe looked something like that. But over time, it becomes something that we don't even think about in the morning. We just do it, and we do it successfully. So here's some actual data from our Ellis program. If you see in October of 2016 on the x-axis that 40% of workdays we had deployments. So that's maybe 2 days out of every week we were deploying. For the federal government, lots of red tape, maybe that seems like that's pretty successful. But we weren't satisfied with that. And so as you can see, by July of 2018, we're able to deploy almost every single day. Now, it's not perfect. There's still some peaks and valleys that are going on there, and that's because there are still impediments to deployment. But what this is showing is that now we have a culture that prioritizes problem solving when we have deployment failures. If we have a circumstance where we can't deploy, then it's everybody's responsibility to resolve that problem as quickly as possible. Stop making code and fix the deployment problem. It's also important to recognize that we have a contracting model where we have teams that are rolling off and rolling on to the contract every 3 to 6 months. We have over 20 teams, and some of those teams that are lower performing, we don't renew the contract, and we bring in another contracting organization. So we're always having new staff that have to get oriented to what it is that we're doing and how we do things at Citizenship and Immigration. But that doesn't disrupt our ability to deploy because we empower our developers as soon as they come in the door to be able to deploy and to be able to problem solve to the best of their ability. So here you can see that clear trajectory where we're almost at the point where we can deploy every day.
So one of the things, one of the more interesting measures we looked at was, can you make it to happy hour? Can you deploy before 4 p.m.? We thought this might be important. A couple of reasons. If you're deploying at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night after a, I don't know, 8, 9, 10-hour day, you got tired people working that deployment. Tired people make mistakes. That's more risk. It also means that if you have a deployment problem, they're probably debugging that problem at 10, 11, 12, who knows? That's also a problem. We also are trying to attract and retain the best people that do this work. And so, we theorized that one way to do that was to give them some better work-life balance. So we worked on this, and I don't think the teams took it seriously until they saw that we were measuring it. Once they see we're measuring it, they know we're pretty serious about it. So way back in October 2016, as you can see here, almost all of our deployments were after hours. Today, by the summer of 2018, 80% of our deployments were happening before 4 p.m. So this is great. This is what we wanted to see. Today, if we're doing a deployment after hours, it's typically because of a major infrastructure change or because we want to experiment with a pipeline. So what did we do? We had to do a number of things to get here. And one of these was, can we deploy and keep end users working? If you're deploying every day and you're trying to do it during business hours, it's pretty important that you don't put your users, don't subject them to a lot of downtime. In fact, you probably don't want to have any downtime. So again, to get there, we started measuring it. We measured disruptive versus non-disruptive deployments. And as you can see, our non-disruptive deployments went from about 15% to about 20% over time. And our disruptive deployments fell from about a little under 15% to just a little over 0, which is great. That's what we wanted to see. That wasn't the only thing we had to do, though. Early on, I think we started this in around the middle of 2016. But before we knew it, the holidays were here. And one of the other things we wanted to do was be able to deploy over the holidays without stressing out our teams. Well, what do people want to do on a holiday? They want to spend time with their families, right? Well, in 2016, we accomplished that mainly by some good scheduling and planning. So we only had one deployment from Christmas week to New Year's Day. And that was good. I mean, you can see here, that's how we measured. Just put them on a calendar and took a look. But that really didn't go far enough. We didn't want to stop deployments. We wanted to keep deploying. So by the end of 2017, here's what we had. We actually had 7 deployments over the same time, but we were able to do it without killing our teams. How did we do that? Well, we measured something else. We expanded the number of release captains we had. Now, in the old days, typically, you had a gray beard on each team who was the guy that knew or girl, who knew everything about the code. They'd seen all the mistakes. They'd done most of the deployments. They kind of knew what needed to get done most of the time. So everybody relied on them. Well, that's not great, though. You want more people to be able to do that. So we started measuring the number of different people who were deploying code. And we encouraged more and more and more, and that built us up. As a result, by today, if you take a look at the people who deploy the most frequently, they're only deploying 10% of the time, which is great. So this not only solves our problem of the holidays, but it increases our overall capacity for deployments. It removes a major bottleneck and constraint, right? That one person who knows everything. It also does something else. It means it removes a vulnerability for security and continuity. If you only have one person who can deploy and they're not available for whatever reason or not disposed, you've got a real problem. So we didn't want that. One of the other things that made this possible was another measure we had, which was peer reviews. We did peer reviews primarily for quality. But the other reason that peer reviews were useful was that it exposed more of the code to more people. Instead of just being familiar with the code you wrote, now you're reviewing code that other people wrote. So you get to learn more about the system as you go on. You also learn from each other. So we measure that too. And this is probably a measure we'll keep looking at even if we don't focus on it. Because if we see a drop, that is a good time to ask questions. Today, about 96% of the code we deploy has peer review comments, and we kind of look at those to evaluate and make sure they're really looking at the code. And we have improved immensely over time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melinda for some operational measures.
All right, so this is a DevOps conference, so it can't all be about deployment, right? And so we also look at some measures of value management. So most organizations have a user help desk, either internal or external, where someone can call in or put in a ticket to say, hey, I'm having a problem with the system. So knowing that information can be helpful, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. Are people calling the help desk? That could be good. It could be bad. If people are calling the help desk, maybe what you deployed wasn't very intuitive. That seems bad. But people are excited to try to use it, so that seems good. If people aren't calling the help desk, maybe there are no problems, so that seems good. Or it means everyone has abandoned your system and moved on to something else, and that could be bad. So understanding the genesis of the information is really important. So from Ellis, there are 4 products that we're measuring here, where between January and July of 2017, we just took a look at the number of tickets that came into the help desk system about those products. And then we compared that to a year later, the same time frame, January to July, this time of 2018, and we can see that there's clearly a decrease in the number of tickets that are coming into the help desk. So now we have to figure out, is that good or is that bad? Is it because our system is intuitive and people are using it more effectively, or is it because people are bailing? And so we looked at our user base. Is our user base decreasing? We expect that we have 1,500 standard users and maybe another 100 or 200 peripheral users that are other stakeholders that could use it, maybe not. And we see that our core users have not decreased at all. And actually, we can see that there are circumstances where there are peaks of other interested stakeholders starting to use the system that weren't using it before. So this clearly shows us that the decrease in help desk tickets is actually because what we're deploying is easier to use and that people find it effective. Now, getting information from our end users doesn't just help us make sure that we're producing things that are effective, it also helps us figure out whether or not our backlogs are the right high-value items. The reality is that when you first create a product backlog, it's really just a prognostication wish list, right? These are the things that we think are going to be high-value items, but we don't really know. And it's not until you actually start creating software and putting it in the hands of end users and talking to them that you can find out whether or not what you're making is actually bringing value to the organization and the people using the system. So we started to look at whether or not people felt empowered to encourage some of those old ideas to be discarded so that we could pivot to new ideas that are coming clearly from the operations folks who are interacting with our end users. And so we started to look at actual discards rates from JIRA. How many of the JIRA items are being removed without being developed? And so you can see that for the first half of 2017, that we were getting rid of, I don't know, about 50 items per month. And now we're getting rid of almost 100 items per month, and clearly in May there was a big initiative to purge, and we got rid of about 500 items that just were not high-value items anymore. So we also started polling the people who are doing the work, because usually most problems that an auditor is going to identify when they come for oversight are things that the people actually working on the systems would be able to tell you themselves. Most of these things are not a mystery. So we just poll the people who work on our systems. Do you have the right tools and the right resources to do your job, right? We ask them, hey, we're in a DevOps environment. Do you have a New Relic account? Well, almost half of the people that we polled were like, oh, I don't know, maybe I do. How do I get into it? Do I have a username and password? Okay, well, clearly that's a training issue that we need to resolve. It could be that we have a bunch of new staff because we just onboarded a bunch of new teams, or it could be that we just haven't communicated this very well. So this is a great opportunity for us to get out ahead of this. We also are in the federal government, so all of our software products have to be accessible to people with disabilities. And a lot of people who come into the program as developers maybe are not experts in accessibility compliance. So we have experts that they can tap into. Do they know them? Do they know how to get to those resources? And so we just ask them. And the folks who don't know, then we can do an intervention and make sure that they know how to get the resources that they need. So don't be shy just to ask questions. Just yes/no questions can yield you some good, actionable information that can help your audit-ready posture. So while testing is important, don't just focus on testing. Most of your challenges are going to come from culture problems. And those culture problems can come from these faint signals about whether or not someone can make it to happy hour and whether or not someone knows if they have an account for New Relic, right? These are not complicated things, but they actually can show you a really good picture of what's going on within your organization. But don't just stick with one metric. You're going to need a bunch of different signals, and we change the signals that we look at all the time because our organization is constantly evolving and shifting, and so the metrics that yield us good information are also evolving and shifting as we go.
Okay, so we want to leave you with a few thoughts. As Melinda said, we adopt these signals chiefly as experiments. We'll find a problem, we'll have a hypothesis for the problem, we'll identify some signals that might be able to address it. If that signal doesn't provide immediate value, then we discard it. But over time, remember, we're trying to solve problems. So over time, if we resolve a problem or substantially resolve a problem, then it's providing less and less value to continue to focus on it. So again, even in the long term, you're probably going to discard a lot of your signals, or at least not focus on them as constantly. Second thing, Gene Kim said at the beginning of this how helpful it was to be able to go back to your colleagues at work and say, even so-and-so is doing DevOps. Well, now you can say even the federal government's doing DevOps. So if that doesn't convince them, I don't know what else will. And I want to give some recognition to two people who I hope are in the audience, Brian DeTersi and Nate Conroy. Guys, could you stand up? These are some of the folks who were instrumental in helping us identify these metrics. So in closing, I want to say if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to see Melinda, Nate, Brian, me. I've always wanted to say this. We're from the federal government, and we're here to help.
And if you guys have any unusual signals that you use to identify health in culture in your organization, please send them our way. We're always looking for new ways to evaluate our organization and our value delivery proposition.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
So that's it. Thank you.